Hello there, my name is Grace Royle, and I am a 2022 McGillicuddy Humanities Center undergraduate fellow, here to talk to you today about my project From Self-Help to Self-Harm, Rhetoric in the Self-Help Industry. Now I want you to imagine that you're in the middle of the Sedona Desert. You're in a tent constructed of tarps and blankets, and you're sitting shoulder to shoulder, knees to back, with over 50 other participants in the structure. Is complete darkness. The only light source you have is coming from the center of the tent, a pit of hot steaming coals in the center of the lodge that keeps the air around you at a steaming 150 degrees Fahrenheit, and the temperature is only continuing to rise. At some point, people start screaming and crying as the tent continues to go hotter as the minutes tick on, and at one point, a man shouts that he feels like he's going to die. The one in charge of the entire event is there. He's standing between his audience and the only exit out of the tent, and his name is James Arthur Ray. His response to the chaos around him is simple: today is a good day to die. Now, by the time this sweat lodge event ends, 3 people will end up dead and several others hospitalized. All the participants had paid approximately $10,000 for this experience. They were there voluntarily. They weren't shackled or bound in any way in that structure. They were technically free to leave, even if Ray was standing in front of their only exit. They were there of their own accord. Ray couldn't have physically stopped them, even if he wanted to. It was a self-help retreat known as Spiritual Warrior, and it took place in 2009. So why did all these people stay? Why did they ignore all of their body's warning signals, even to the point of death for some, just because Ray had told them to? Now, this is a question that didn't stop nagging at me when I first heard about this case from the Wondery podcast guru, The Age of Enlightenment. I wanted to know just how this man, James Arthur Ray, had the power to keep all of these people under his control, even when their bodies were failing and shutting down on them. And through my research, I came upon this project. And the most important answer that I came across was rhetoric. So what exactly is rhetoric? Well, in the simplest of terms, it is the art of persuasion. It's performance with a purpose. It is the meaning in everything and anything around us, in our body language, in the words that we speak, in our habits, in our behaviors. It's every part of our everyday lives. It's even in the inanimate objects around us, in the advertisements that we're subjected to daily, in the artwork on our wall. Rhetoric is the meaning in everything, whether it's intentional or not, because persuasion is pathological. We don't have a choice. We're persuaded by everything. Rhetoric itself is also a tool that we can use to persuade the people around us. Because it's neither good nor evil, and because of that, it can also produce as many negative consequences as it can positive, regardless of people's intentions. So it's been identified as an alarmingly powerful tool by ancient scholars all the way back in ancient Greece. We had the infamous scholar Plato, who heavily criticized rhetoric because in his opinion, rhetoricians were nothing more than lords because of the power that persuasion and influence has over listening minds. And likewise, he viewed the audience of rhetoricians as nothing more than victims. He actually thought that the listeners of these speakers were victims because they didn't have a choice. They were being persuaded whether they wanted to or not, regardless of the person's intentions, and those consequences could go either way. Now, this is especially relevant information in today's self-help industry, where people are actually paying to be persuaded. That's why this market is so unique. You are paying to be influenced, and you're putting your well-being in the hands of self-proclaimed gurus who are currently held to no standard, who need no certain qualifications or certifications. Anyone can be a guru. It's persuasion, it's influence, you're paying to be persuaded. And according to Plato, this puts these clients at a very dangerous disadvantage for the sake of self-improvement. They're trying to better themselves, and they're saying, challenge me, change me, influence me, push me to my limits, and I'll be better because of that. And the line between what becomes self-help, the line between self-help and self-harm can become very blurred in these circumstances. And that's why cases like James Arthur Ray's are able to get out of hand to such extremes. It's because rhetoric can get misused and we don't see the warning signs until it's too late. So as I conducted my research, I ended up discovering that the case of James Arthur Ray's 2009 tragedy was a textbook example of what Plato warned to be lordship and dangerous rhetoric. He quite literally, at one point of the retreat, dressed up as a lord. He dressed up as a god, he put on a white robe and a golden sash, and one of the activities that he had his participants do was they had to perform tasks in complete silence at his bidding. If they broke the silence at any point, he would point at them and scream, "Die, die," until they fell to the ground and they had to remain there motionless for up to 5 hours, some say, until the game was over. All these little details throughout the event built up over time to the sweat lodge, which occurred later on. He controlled what they ate, he controlled their transportation in the middle of the desert, he controlled where they slept, and at some point they were even sleeping last minute out in the middle of the desert with no shelter, no preparation, no food and water. Now it sounds quite familiar if you think about infamous cult cases and psychological conditioning, and that is the fine line that Plato warns rhetoricians can cross into when they're persuading people. And this isn't the only case. This isn't the only time that this has happened. In my research, I also ended up uncovering the case of Keith Rainier. Now, Keith Rainier ran a company called Nixvium, a self-improvement company, for up to 20 years. And at that 20-year mark, it was actually shut down, and Rainier was arrested for multiple accounts of abuse, human trafficking, assault, and more. And it all took place under the guise of self-help, and it took place for over 2 decades. So just how was this possible? I ended up discovering that Keith Rainier was utilizing something called weaponized rhetoric, in which case logic and reasoning is then used to appeal to someone's desires or their prejudices in order to maintain control over them. And there's a name for those that use this kind of weaponized rhetoric: demagogue. Demagogue. That is the most perfect description that I have of Keith Rainier to describe the impact that he had over his victims. A demagogue is someone, a leader, who uses rhetoric and logic to maintain a hold over people. And that is exactly what he did when he titled himself the Grand Master at the top of his business, and his victims he would actually refer to as his slaves. He kept these slaves, he branded them, he gave them tasks to do. They were pleasure slaves, they carried out tasks for him. They were slaves, and he disguised it all under the guise of self-help. He told these people that this was the peak of learning self-discipline and self-improvement, that this was how they would reach their fullest potential. All they had to do was trust him, and it worked for over 20 years. Keith Rainier was a demagogue. He weaponized rhetoric, and he did so extremely successfully, unfortunately at the cost of several innocent victims, including several minors. Today, Keith Rainier was arrested, and he is still behind bars. He is facing over 100 years life sentence imprisonment for his crimes. And then for my last case, I decided to look at some of the fields of self-help that are a little more regulated than the normal gurus. Specifically, I decided to look at a case of psychiatry gone wrong, when Dr. Isaac Hirschkopf was able to manipulate his patient for nearly 30 years. And at the end of those 30 years, he had control of his bank account, his estate, his finances, and his family business. This patient, Martin Markowitz, worked with Dr. Hirschkopf for 27 years, and in that time, the doctor became his only friend and business partner. He cut off his family for him, he cut off his friends, he compromised his relationships with his coworkers and his business partners, all because the doctor told him, "This is how you better yourself." He even told Markowitz at several points that he was unlovable, that he was weak. He nicknamed him Easy Marty Markowitz. How did Dr. Hirschkopf manage to convince Martin to go through with all of this in a very highly regulated industry? It's psychiatry. It was a professional doctor-patient relationship. Well, I uncovered 2 more rhetorical elements that I hadn't seen in the other cases, because Dr. Hirschkopf didn't fit the description of a demagogue like Rainier did. I discovered that Dr. Hirschkopf used isolation and a strategy known as exhaustive rhetoric to maintain control over his victim. The former involved Hirschkopf isolating Markowitz from his family and friends, and this led to the latter, exhaustive rhetoric. Now, this is a strategy that involves being relentless upon your listener until the persuasion effectively starts taking a hold of them and keeps them exactly where you want to be. Now, considering Hirschkopf and Markowitz worked together for approximately 27 years, I would say that this was the biggest factor in how he was able to maintain control through just words and persuasion, and managed to convince Markowitz to give him over basically his entire life for almost 3 decades. Now, it sounds insane, doesn't it? I at least thought so as I was conducting all of this research and discovering all of these tactics hidden and that we use in everyday life that could go so wrong in an environment that's supposed to protect people and help them feel safe and help them achieve their best selves. And I'm looking at all these cases not to condemn the self-improvement or the self-help industry, because I do believe that these aspects are important, especially in an age where mental health awareness is finally coming to a head and getting the attention it deserves. But I'm trying to identify the way that persuasion can turn sour to make sure that people are safe in these circumstances. Through my research, I not only discovered that rhetoric can turn sour and flip on itself to become dangerous, but I also discovered strategies such as weaponized rhetoric, demagoguery, and exhaustive rhetoric, highlighted in all of these different cases. Now, we've already seen these strategies play out in cults, like I mentioned before, or problematic political leaders that somehow manage to stay in power despite heavy controversy around them. Now I'm trying to bring that attention to the self-help industry, where all of these strategies and all of these outcomes can be overlooked because it's viewed as a scam, or, oh, they're paying to be persuaded because it's all voluntary. That is why I like looking at these cases through a rhetorical lens, because it takes away from the traditional victim blaming that often occurs when we analyze the cases. Oh, they should have known better. Oh, why did they listen? They should have just walked away. The red flags are right there in hindsight. Why didn't they pay attention? That's exactly what my project is trying to get at. The power of rhetoric is so invisible, but so extreme. Ancient Greek scholars like Plato were looking at rhetoric all the way back then, and they identified it as a potential threat, and it's still potent today in today's society, maybe even more so considering the impact that social media has on us, advertisements everywhere, etc. All of this information that I've talked about here goes into even more detail in my research paper, From Self-Help to Self-Harm, Rhetoric in the Self-Help Industry. There I will go into further detail about how all of these cases, step by step, used rhetoric to impact each individual audience, from the attendees of the Spiritual Warrior event to Nix VM's slaves and victims to Dr. Isaac Hirschkopf's Martin Markowitz patient. Hopefully, through that research, you'll be able to leave with a better understanding of how rhetoric can be abused and how severe the outcomes of that abuse can be. If anything, we'll now better understand how rhetoric and persuasion works in the pathologically persuasive environment that we live in today. Thank you. And thank you especially to Karen Sieber, Mike Sokolow, Nathan Stormer, and all those at the McGillicuddy Humanities Center for their immense support and help throughout this research experience. Once again, my name is Grace Royle, and I am a 2022 undergraduate fellow for the McGillicuddy Humanities Center. Thank you for watching.